The Mafia boss's voice echoed through the restaurant as his fist slammed against the table, the force of the blow making the wine glasses rattle. He was dressed in a dark suit, impeccably tailored, the kind that announced his importance, his dangerousness, in the usually quiet Boston neighborhood. His crew, 6 men in total, instantly tensed, their hands subtly moving under their jackets as their boss's face twisted with fury. All because the young waitress had told him his favorite table wasn't available that night. A minor inconvenience that had sparked this outburst. "Restauranto," he spat in perfect Italian, his northern accent clear as he launched into a string of insults, clearly thinking no one there understood his words. Diners around them looked away, pretending they didn't hear the drama unfolding. The waitress, a slim woman with auburn hair in a simple ponytail, remained still, her face impossible to read as she listened to his tirade. She wore only a touch of lip gloss, her natural beauty needing nothing more. Then, after 3 seconds of thick silence, she leaned forward, her green eyes locking onto his cold blue ones. "Capisco perfettamente," she replied, her Italian flawless, her accent perfect. The color instantly vanished from his face as she continued in Italian, letting him know she understood every single word he'd said, every insult and threat. The restaurant seemed to freeze, everyone in shock as she calmly suggested he wait 15 minutes like everyone else or find another place to eat. His men glanced at each other, unsure how to react to someone standing up to their notorious boss. The man himself seemed caught between anger and fascination, his eyes narrowing as he studied her with a new intensity. "Who taught you to speak like that?" he asked in English, his voice softer now but still carrying an underlying threat that made the nearby diners even more uncomfortable. His question was more than just curiosity. It carried suspicion. "My grandmother was from Florence," she replied simply, never breaking eye contact. "Now, would you like to wait at the bar? Or should I recommend another restaurant?" Something flickered across the man's face, a hint of respect, maybe even a flicker of amusement. His men remained tense, their hands close to their hidden weapons, waiting for his reaction to this unexpected defiance. "The bar will be fine," he finally said, rising from his seat with a smooth, almost graceful movement that didn't match his large frame. "And bring me your best scotch. Neat." The tension in the restaurant eased slightly as he walked toward the bar, though the conversations remained hushed. The waitress let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, her hands trembling slightly from the adrenaline. Later that night, as she served appetizers to his table, he left a large tip under his water glass and slid a business card across the table. Andrew Valentini, it read, with only a phone number embossed in gold beneath his name. "My apologies for earlier," he said quietly, his tone sincere despite the dangerous glint that never quite left his eyes. "Perhaps I could make it up to you sometime." 2 days later, Claire pushed open the door to her favorite coffee shop, the little bell jingling as she escaped the unexpected autumn rain. Water dripped from her hair as she shook her coat. The rich smell of coffee filled the air, a comforting welcome after a morning of teaching Italian literature to a room full of bored undergraduates. She ordered her usual, a cappuccino with an extra shot of espresso, and looked for a place to sit in the crowded shop. Then she saw him, Andrew Valentini, sitting alone by the window, completely absorbed in a leather-bound notebook. He wasn't wearing a tie, his crisp white shirt unbuttoned at the collar, giving a glimpse of a tattoo that disappeared under his expensive clothes. He recognized her when he looked up, and something that looked like genuine pleasure crossed his face. He closed his notebook deliberately and gestured to the empty chair across from him. It was an invitation that felt both dangerous and impossible to refuse. "I didn't expect to see you here," Claire said as she sat down, her voice calmer than she felt. The coffee shop suddenly seemed smaller, as if his presence took up all the space in the room. Andrew smiled, and the hard lines around his eyes softened. "I own the building," he replied, his voice lower than she remembered. "I come here to think sometimes." Claire studied him across the small table, noticing the dark circles under his eyes and the tension in his shoulders. "You look like someone carrying too many secrets," she said before she could stop herself. His expression changed, surprise replacing the carefully neutral look he usually wore. "Most people are too afraid to speak to me that way," he said, leaning forward slightly. "Why aren't you?" My father always said fear is just curiosity that hasn't found its voice yet," she replied, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. "And I've always been too curious for my own good." Andrew laughed, a real laugh that made people look their way. "Your father sounds like a wise man," he said, studying her with renewed interest. "Is he the one who taught you to stand your ground against men like me?" Claire's face clouded over for a moment as she traced the rim of her cup with one finger. "My father died when I was 15, she answered quietly. "But yes, he taught me never to bow my head to intimidation." Silence fell between them, not uncomfortable, but not easy either, just a space filled with unspoken questions. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming against the windows and creating a private backdrop for their unexpected meeting. "My grandmother from Florence," Andrew began, breaking the silence. "She used to quote Dante to me when I was a child." He spoke the line perfectly, his accent flawless, the words flowing smoothly. "Amor che muove il sol e il tristel." Claire's eyes widened slightly, recognizing the line from Paradiso, "The love that moves the sun and the other stars." She translated automatically. "You've read Dante's Divine Comedy. There are many sides to me that might surprise you, Claire," he said, using her name for the first time. The sound of it on his lips sent a shiver down her spine. Claire's apartment was her sanctuary, filled with books and warm colors, bookshelves covering every wall in her small one-bedroom apartment. Classical music played softly as she graded papers, marking comments in red pen on her students' essays on Petrarchan sonnets. Her life followed a predictable pattern. Teaching during the day, research in the evenings, the occasional dinner with colleagues who shared her love of Renaissance literature. She had built this quiet life deliberately after the chaos of her childhood, finding comfort in academic pursuits. Andrew's world was completely different, as he was reminded every day as he sat in his office overlooking Boston Harbor, listening to reports about territory disputes. The Valentini family had controlled the waterfront for 3 generations, their legal businesses hiding much more profitable illegal ones. The weight of his responsibilities pressed down on him as he dismissed his lieutenants, leaving him alone with the panoramic view of the city he protected and exploited. His father's portrait hung on the wall, a constant reminder of expectations and legacy. 3 weeks had passed since the coffee shop, and Andrew had found himself thinking about Claire more often than he wanted to admit. Her directness, so unlike the calculated deference he was used to, had made an impression on him that he couldn't easily dismiss. He turned her business card over in his fingers. Not his, but hers, the one she'd given him as they parted ways. Boston University, Department of Italian Studies, it read, along with her name and contact information, a glimpse into her world. The logical part of his brain warned him against pursuing anything with someone so far removed from his own reality. Claire lived in the light, in a world of ideas and beauty, while he operated in the shadows, and in pragmatic violence when necessary. And yet, something about her had awakened a long-dormant curiosity, a desire to experience something real in a life surrounded by calculated relationships and strategic loyalties. Her honesty was as refreshing as it was dangerous. He reached for his phone, hesitating only briefly before dialing her number. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across his office as he waited, wondering what he would say when she answered. Claire's voice, a little breathless, as if she'd rushed to answer, filled the line. "Professor Montgomery speaking," she said, professional and composed despite the slight change in her tone. "It's Andrew," he replied simply, realizing he had no prepared speech, no strategic approach to this conversation. "I was wondering if you might be free for dinner tomorrow evening?" The silence that followed felt like forever, filled with all the reasons why this was a terrible idea. Their worlds existed on opposite sides of an unbridgeable gap. Academia and organized crime, literature and power, transparency and secrets. "There's a small Italian place on Hanover Street," she finally answered, surprising both of them with her acceptance. "I'll meet you there." As he confirmed the details, Andrew felt something shift inside him, a subtle change in his priorities. For the first time in years, business would wait while he pursued something for himself, regardless of the problems it would cause. Claire hung up the phone and stared at it, wondering what had made her accept his invitation. Something in his voice had gotten past her carefully constructed defenses, touching a part of her that wanted more than the safety of books and classrooms. The small Italian restaurant on Hanover Street buzzed with conversation as Claire entered, her emerald dress catching the soft glow of the lights. She saw Andrew right away, sitting in a corner booth away from the windows, two of his men standing discreetly at the bar. "You look beautiful," he said as she slid into the seat across from him, his eyes taking in the simple gold necklace she wore. The owner himself came over with a bottle of wine, bowing slightly to Andrew with obvious respect. Claire noticed other diners glancing their way, curiosity and fear mixed in their quick looks. "People are afraid of you?" she asked quietly as the wine was poured. "Does that bother you?" Andrew considered her question, swirling the red wine in his glass before answering. "Fear creates distance," he finally replied. "And sometimes distance is necessary in my position." They ordered in Italian, and the conversation flowed more easily than either of them had expected as they discovered shared interests beyond Dante. Andrew talked about his travels through Tuscany, while Claire described the year she spent researching in the Florence archives. "My grandmother would have liked you," he said unexpectedly, his face softening with the memory. "She used to say that strong women are God's way of keeping powerful men honest." As dinner went on, Claire found herself drawn to the contradictions in him. The ruthless businessman who could quote poetry, the feared leader who spoke of his grandmother with such tenderness. The warning bells in her mind grew quieter with each glass of wine. Andrew felt something change inside him as he watched her laugh, a genuine sound untouched by calculation or fear. He was used to people telling him what they thought he wanted to hear, their words carefully chosen to avoid his anger. "Why did you really invite me to dinner?" Claire asked suddenly, her directness cutting through the pleasant haze of wine and conversation. Her green eyes held his, wanting truth, not charm. The question caught him off guard, taking away the practiced responses he usually relied on. "Because you're the first person in years who spoke to me as a man rather than a reputation," he answered, surprising himself with his honesty. Claire nodded slowly, accepting his answer without comment as she sipped her wine. Outside the restaurant, a black SUV with tinted windows pulled up, the driver watching the entrance carefully. Two more cars joined the first, parking strategically along the street as men in dark suits got out, adjusting their jackets to better hide their shoulder holsters. Andrew's phone buzzed with a text message, his expression hardening as he read it. "We need to leave," he said, his tone suddenly businesslike as he signaled for the check. "Now, Claire." She felt the change in atmosphere, the tension coming from him as his men at the bar straightened up, their hands moving under their jackets. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice low and controlled despite her racing heart. Andrew leaned closer, his voice barely a whisper. "There are men outside who want to hurt us," he said simply. "Trust me right now, and I promise I'll explain everything later." 6 days passed before Claire heard from Andrew again. 6 days of jumping at shadows and questioning her own judgment. She'd been rushed home that night through a service entrance, Andrew's men forming a protective shield around her until she was safely inside her apartment. The next morning, news reports mentioned a shooting outside an Italian restaurant in the North End. 2 men had died in what police were calling a gang-related incident. Claire recognized the restaurant, knew that she could have been caught in the crossfire. When Andrew finally called, his voice sounded strained, almost regretful. "I need to see you," he said simply. "To explain things properly if you'll let me." This time they met at his penthouse overlooking the harbor. Floor-to-ceiling windows gave a panoramic view of boats drifting like white specks on the darkening water. Security personnel patrolled the perimeter discreetly, a reminder of the danger that followed him. "Those men were from the Calabrese family," Andrew explained as he poured her a glass of whiskey. His movements were precise, controlled. They've been trying to move into our territory for months now. Claire accepted the drink, letting the whiskey burn down her throat. And what exactly is your territory? She asked, no longer willing to avoid the truth about who he was. Andrew studied her for a long moment, considering his answer. Import, export, construction, waste management, he began, then paused, adding more quietly, protection services, some gambling operations, control of certain shipping routes. You're telling me you're in the Mafia? Claire stated flatly, no question in her voice as pieces of the puzzle she deliberately avoided suddenly fell into place. The restaurant confrontation, the special treatment, the armed escorts, it all made sense now. Andrew didn't deny it. His silence was enough as he moved to stand by the window, his reflection barely visible against the night sky. My father built this organization, he said finally. I inherited both its benefits and its burdens. Claire set her glass down carefully, the crystal making a soft sound against the marble table. I should leave, she said, rising from her seat, suddenly aware of the danger she had invited into her life. You should, he agreed, turning to face her. Walking away right now would be the sensible choice. The moment hung between them, full of possibilities both tempting and terrifying. Claire took a step toward the door, then stopped, her reflection joining his in the window as she moved to stand beside him instead. I've never been particularly sensible, she admitted, her voice barely audible above the soft hum of the air conditioning. My mother always said that was my greatest flaw. Andrew's hand found hers, his fingers interlacing with hers, a gentleness that didn't fit his dangerous reputation. Tell me about her, he said, inviting her to share more than just space. The hours went by as they talked, really talked, the barriers between them falling as the night got darker. Andrew spoke of his father's expectations, the weight of family legacy that had shaped his choices since he was a child. Claire revealed her own complicated past. Her father's death in what the authorities had called a random mugging, her mother's spiral into addiction, and her own determination to build something stable from the chaos. There was no pretense between them, only raw, unfiltered truth. Dawn was breaking when Andrew finally called a car to take her home, exhaustion and emotional intimacy creating a different kind of vulnerability between them. This can't work, he said softly as they stood in the elevator. You know that, don't you? 3 weeks of careful happiness followed, a delicate balance between Claire's academic world and the glimpses she saw of Andrew's, glimpses that were always carefully controlled. They met in private, her apartment, his penthouse, a lakeside cabin outside the city, avoiding the public eye and the dangers it might bring. The change in Andrew was subtle but noticeable to those who knew him well. His lieutenant Carlos noticed it first, the slight softening around his eyes, the occasional distraction during business meetings, the private phone calls that brought rare smiles to his face. The Calabratzes are making moves again, Carlos reported one afternoon, sliding surveillance photos across Andrew's desk. They've been watching the university, boss, specifically the Italian Studies department. Ice formed in Andrew's veins as he looked at the images. Claire leaving her classroom, stopping for coffee, unlocking her apartment door. The message couldn't have been clearer if they'd written it in blood across her door. He dismissed Carlos with a nod, then sat alone in his office as darkness fell, considering options that all seemed to end in loss. The Valentini family had enemies, always had, always would. It was the nature of the business, the price of power in their world. Claire had become his weakness, a vulnerability his enemies had identified and would exploit. The realization settled heavily in his stomach as he reached for his phone to make the call that would break both their hearts. She knew something was wrong the moment she saw his face, the careful blankness in his expression as he entered her apartment that evening. You're ending this, she said before he could speak, her academic mind quickly processing the evidence before her. They know about you, Andrew confirmed, staying a careful distance from her. The Calabrese family, they've been watching you, sending a message to me through their surveillance. The photographs Carlos had shown Andrew revealed not just Claire's daily routine, but something more disturbing. a man in a dark coat who had been following her for weeks undetected. This shadow had stood outside her classroom, waited across from her favorite bookstore, even sat 3 tables away during her weekly coffee meetup with colleagues. Andrew's security team had identified him as Paolo Calabrese, nephew of the family patriarch, and known for his particular cruelty. The message was clear. They knew how to hurt Andrew most effectively, and they were demonstrating their patience. Claire's fingers trembled as she took this in. Memories of her father's last days became vivid in her mind. He, too, had been followed before his cover was blown. Subtle warnings had escalated into that final, fatal encounter that the police had dismissed as random violence. "There's something else," Andrew said, his voice dropping even lower as he pulled out his phone and showed her an intercepted message. On the screen was a conversation between Calabrese operatives mentioning Claire's mother, her address, her medication schedule, her vulnerability. The color drained from Claire's face as she read the exchange, realizing the threat extended beyond her to the one person she had left in the world. Her mother had rebuilt her life after years of addiction following her husband's murder. Her sobriety was a fragile treasure that Claire refused to see destroyed. Claire felt her carefully constructed world tilting. The danger she had acknowledged intellectually had suddenly become real. "So, you're just giving up?" she challenged, anger masking the fear crawling up her spine. "I'm protecting you," he corrected, his voice hardening with resolve. "This isn't a negotiation, Claire. These people don't make empty threats, and I won't risk your life because of who I am." The silence that followed felt heavy and suffocating. Claire moved to her bookshelf, tracing the spine of a worn copy of Dante before turning back to face him. "My father wasn't killed in a random mugging," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "He worked for the FBI investigating organized crime in Chicago. His cover was blown 2 days before he was murdered." Andrew's expression changed, surprise followed by understanding as this new information made him rethink everything he knew about her. "You knew who I was from the beginning," he realized, putting the pieces together. "I recognized your name that first night at the restaurant," she admitted, meeting his gaze. "The Valentini family has quite a file in the federal records. I should know. I've read it cover to cover." Andrew moved toward her, stopping just short of touching her. "Why would you risk yourself like this? Was it some misguided attempt at justice for your father?" Claire shook her head, a sad smile on her lips. "I told myself I was just curious at first. Then I told myself I was gathering information. But the truth—" She paused, her vulnerability visible in her eyes. "I fell in love with the man behind the name, despite everything I knew I should feel." Andrew stepped back, creating space while his mind raced. "You need to leave Boston," he said, his voice firm. "Tonight. I'll arrange everything. New identity, new position at a university far from here." Claire shook her head, defiance flashing in her eyes, despite the fear. "I won't be chased away from my life, my career, everything I've built," she insisted, crossing her arms. "This isn't a game, Claire," Andrew replied, frustration in his voice as he ran a hand through his hair. "The Calabrese family doesn't make idle threats. They'll use you to get to me, and they won't be gentle about it." The weight of reality settled over them as night fell outside. By morning, she had agreed to a temporary compromise, a sabbatical officially to do research, but actually to disappear until Andrew could fix the threat. He didn't tell her his plan, didn't mention the meeting scheduled with the heads of 3 allied families, didn't discuss the gamble he was about to make. Some burdens were his to carry, the price of his position. The goodbye at the private airfield was short, practical, both of them aware of watching eyes that might report to enemies. 6 weeks, Andrew promised, holding her hand a moment longer than necessary. "Stay safe." As her plane disappeared into the clouds, Andrew returned to his car where Carlos waited with details of the upcoming meeting. The plan was in motion, a change that would either save his future or destroy everything his family had built. Empty days turned into weeks as Claire settled into the remote cabin in northern Maine. The only company she kept was the discreet security team stationed around the property's perimeter. She spent countless hours researching and writing, desperately trying to ignore the nagging worry that constantly chipped away at her concentration. The satellite phone Andrew had given her remained stubbornly silent, except for brief, obligatory check-ins once a week. Each time she heard his voice, it sounded more strained, despite his repeated assurances that everything was proceeding exactly as planned. She recognized the telltale signs of a man carrying an immense, unbearable burden. For weeks into her self-imposed exile, Claire woke one morning to find the head of her security detail standing in her kitchen. His expression was grave as he handed her a sealed envelope. "Direct orders from Mr. Valentini," he stated simply, stepping back respectfully to give her some privacy. Inside, she found a single sheet of paper containing 3 sentences scrawled in Andrew's unmistakable handwriting. "Whatever you hear, don't believe it. Wait for Carlos. I love you." The last 3 words swam before her eyes, blurred by the tears that suddenly welled up. It was the first time he had ever expressed that sentiment so directly and openly. 2 days later, the news reports exploded with the shocking announcement of the murder of Boston crime boss Andrew Valentini. He had been gunned down outside his downtown office in what authorities were already describing as a violent escalation in an ongoing turf war. The security team surrounding Claire's remote cabin immediately doubled in size. Carlos arrived 3 days after the news broke, his face drawn and haggard with exhaustion. He presented Claire with a thumb drive and a set of passports. "He wanted you to have these," he said simply, refusing to offer any further explanation as he escorted her to a waiting helicopter. The contents of the thumb drive explained everything in excruciating detail. There was detailed evidence of the Calabrese family's extensive operations, financial records meticulously documenting corrupt officials, and precise locations of hidden weapon caches and drug warehouses. Andrew had painstakingly compiled enough irrefutable evidence to completely destroy his rivals. The most damning evidence, however, came from an entirely unexpected source. Andrew had somehow managed to obtain internal Calabrese family documents, directly linking them to the murder of Claire's father 8 years earlier. The hit had been ordered as retribution for his undercover work, with details that had never been released to the public or even to his own family. Claire sat frozen in her cabin's living room, her eyes fixated on her father's case file that Andrew had thoughtfully included. It contained information that the FBI had deliberately withheld from her family all these years. The official story of a random mugging had been nothing more than a convenient lie, carefully protecting ongoing investigations while callously denying them any sense of closure. Among the evidence, she found an audio recording of Paolo Calabrese boasting about eliminating the Montgomery problem, describing with sickening detail how Claire's father had been followed for weeks before the carefully staged robbery that left him bleeding to death in a dark alley. Her hands trembled uncontrollably as she forced herself to listen to the very end. Andrew had included a personal letter explaining his elaborate plan. By sacrificing his own identity and position, he could ensure that the Calabrese family would fall completely, while simultaneously creating an opportunity for both of them to escape the endless cycle of violence. His detailed confession would be released only after he was presumed dead, timed precisely to inflict maximum damage on his enemies. The final set of coordinates led to a secluded coastal property registered under a shell company, purchased 3 years earlier when Andrew had first begun contemplating an exit strategy. Before meeting Claire, it had been merely a contingency plan. After knowing her, it had become his ultimate goal, a possibility of something he had never dared to hope for: freedom. Claire understood the full magnitude of what he had done, the incredible sacrifice he had made, not just for her, but for himself. A genuine chance at freedom from the life that had been chosen for him, rather than by him. The final file contained coordinates and a date 3 weeks in the future. The FBI raid on the Calabrese family headquarters made international headlines. The sheer scale of the arrests was unprecedented in organized crime investigations of the past decade. Claire watched from a nondescript hotel room in Vancouver, her new passport identifying her as Professor Catherine Miller. Witness testimony from an unnamed high-level informant had provided authorities with everything they needed to dismantle one of the East Coast's most dangerous criminal organizations. Speculation about the informant's identity ran wild in news reports and all over social media. Prosecutors announced immunity deals for several members of the Valentini organization in exchange for their testimony against the Calabrese family and the corrupt officials they had been bribing for years. The carefully orchestrated legal maneuver bore the unmistakable signature of someone who had meticulously planned every single detail. Carlos arrived exactly 2 weeks after the raids, bringing news that the remaining Valentini operations had been legally restructured under legitimate business entities. He transferred everything, Carlos explained, all legitimate now, with the right people in place. Claire listened in stunned silence as Carlos detailed the incredible transformation Andrew had engineered. The charitable foundation established in his grandmother's name. The scholarship fund for children of violence victims. The witness protection arrangements for former associates willing to leave the life of crime behind. He planned this for months, she realized aloud, the pieces of the puzzle finally falling into place as she remembered his distracted moments. The late-night phone calls, the mysterious meetings. The Calabrese threat had simply accelerated his timeline. Carlos nodded, a rare smile briefly crossing his weathered face. Boss always said meeting you changed everything. Made him want something different, something better. He handed her a final envelope before departing. The coordinates he sent. Be there in 1 week. The small coastal town in Oregon seemed worlds away from Boston's violent criminal underworld. Waves crashed relentlessly against the rugged cliffs as Claire drove along the winding road, her heart pounding against her ribs as she approached the isolated cottage perched precariously on the headland. She hardly recognized him at first. His hair was longer, his face thinner, and his expensive designer suits had been replaced by casual clothes that somehow made him seem both younger and more substantial. Andrew stood on the porch watching her approach, uncertainty clearly visible in his posture. The reports of my death were greatly exaggerated, he said as she stepped out of the car, his attempt at humor undermined by the vulnerability in his eyes. The unspoken question hung heavy in the air between them. Would she stay now that everything had changed so drastically? Claire slowly crossed the distance between them, carefully taking in the subtle changes in him. The immense weight of leadership visibly lifted from his shoulders. So, who are you now, if not Andrew Valentini? She asked, stopping just short of touching him. The cottage held other welcome surprises. A small, well-equipped office with 2 job offers already arranged. University positions that would allow them both to teach while maintaining a low profile. Andrew had leveraged connections far removed from his criminal world to secure these legitimate opportunities, ensuring they would have a means to support themselves. On the bookshelf, nestled beside classics of Italian literature, sat several leather-bound journals, Andrew's personal writings from the past year, documenting his gradual disillusionment with the family business, and his increasingly desperate search for a way out that wouldn't result in bloodshed for those loyal to him. My grandmother once told me that a man can't outrun his past, but he can choose to plant different seeds for his future, he said, leading Claire to the back porch that overlooked the crashing waves below. The breathtaking view stretched endlessly, a powerful metaphor for the possibilities neither of them had ever believed were within their reach. Claire noticed other subtle changes in his demeanor. Gone was the vigilant tension that had always characterized his movements in Boston, the constant awareness of potential threats and the relentless calculation of advantage. In its place was something approaching peace, although old habits clearly died hard, as evidenced by the way his eyes still scanned the perimeter periodically. What struck her most profoundly was the sound of his laugh, fuller and more uninhibited than she had ever heard it before, no longer constrained by the heavy weight of reputation and responsibility that had burdened him for so long. When he spoke of their future possibilities, his hands moved animatedly, painting vivid pictures of ordinary joys that had once seemed like impossible fantasies. David Wells, he answered, presenting a new identity meticulously created through channels that couldn't be traced back to either of them. History professor with a specialization in Renaissance Italian literature. Apparently, I've just been offered a position at Pacific Northwest University. Sunlight broke through the clouds as Claire closed the final distance between them, her hand gently reaching up to touch his face, confirming the reality of his presence. Professor Wells will definitely need someone to show him around the department, she said softly. The kiss that followed was unlike any they had shared before. No dark shadows lurking at the edges. No unspoken threats hanging over their heads. Just the pure, unadulterated possibility of something neither of them had ever dared to truly hope for. Second chances were exceedingly rare in either of their worlds. Andrew led her inside the cozy cottage, where books already lined the shelves and research papers were neatly spread across a desk by the window. "I've been catching up on my Dante," he explained, a hint of his old confidence returning as he eagerly showed her his new life. 1 year later, Claire stood in the faculty lounge of Pacific Northwest University, watching David effortlessly interact with his colleagues during the department's welcome reception. He moved with ease among the academics, his natural charm and genuine interest in their work quickly making him a favorite among the faculty. No one ever questioned their carefully constructed backstory. They had met at a conference in Florence, bonded over shared research interests, and fallen in love amidst the ancient architecture and timeless poetry. The simple narrative contained just enough truth to be convincing while revealing absolutely nothing of the danger that had brought them together. "Your husband is quite the addition to our department," the dean commented, joining Claire by the refreshment table. "His paper on modern interpretations of Dante's Inferno has already been accepted for the prestigious symposium in Chicago next month." Claire smiled, a mixture of pride and amusement as she watched David expertly navigate a heated debate about translation ethics with the linguistics professor. The very same skills that had once helped him manage criminal territories now served him surprisingly well in the world of academic politics. Their small cottage had gradually become a true home over the past year, filled with books and music and the comfortable routines of a shared life. Sometimes at night, she would find him standing on the porch, gazing out over the ocean with an expression that suggested he still couldn't quite believe his newfound freedom. The nightmares came less frequently now. Those terrifying moments when he would wake suddenly, instinctively reaching for weapons that were no longer there, still haunted by the difficult decisions he had made in his former life. Claire had her own ghosts, of course, her father's memory, a constant presence that both connected and complicated their relationship. They had made a pact to be honest about their pasts while focusing intently on their future, acknowledging the darkness without allowing it to eclipse the light they had somehow managed to find together. Some days were undeniably easier than others, the transition from their former lives still a work in progress. David excused himself from the academic discussion and made his way back to Claire's side, his hand finding hers with the easy familiarity of people who had faced death together and emerged stronger. "Ready to go home?" he asked, the private smile they shared containing worlds of meaning. The scenic drive along the coast was one of their simple pleasures, windows down to let in the invigorating salt air as David recounted amusing faculty politics with the same analytical precision he once applied to complicated territory disputes. Some skills, it seemed, transferred surprisingly well across vastly different worlds. At home, Claire kicked off her shoes and headed to the kitchen while David instinctively checked the perimeter, a security habit he couldn't quite break, even after all this time. Despite the peaceful nature of their new life, old instincts died hard, particularly those that had once kept them alive. Later, as soft moonlight spilled across their bed, David gently traced the line of Claire's jaw with his fingers. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly, the question he still occasionally needed reassurance on. "Giving up your position in Boston, your colleagues, your name?" Claire turned to face him fully, her answer requiring absolutely no thought. "I gave up a job and a location," she corrected him gently. "But I found myself and I found us. That's not a sacrifice, David. It's a choice I'd make again in a heartbeat." David reached for the small box on the nightstand, something he had been carrying around for weeks, waiting for the right moment to present it. "I was thinking," he said, opening it to reveal a simple gold band. "Maybe we could make it official. Legally. With our new names and our new life." Claire's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the ring. Not an expensive diamond that would have perfectly suited his former status, but a delicate gold band inset with small emeralds, the exact shade of her eyes. The thoughtful choice perfectly reflected everything about their incredible transformation. Priorities had irrevocably shifted from power to beauty. A year and a half after their first tense confrontation in that bustling Boston restaurant, David whispered the same 3 words in Italian that had changed everything. Ti amo Davo, I truly love you. This time, however, they weren't spoken in anger or fear, but as a heartfelt promise for their future together. The small coastal community had accepted them easily and without reservation. The new history professor and his wife, the Italian literature specialist who occasionally gave lectures at the local library on Renaissance poetry. Their neighbors generally found them charming, if somewhat private, never suspecting the constant vigilance hidden just behind their friendly smiles. Claire had found unexpected fulfillment in teaching community college students, many of whom were first-generation Americans or immigrants seeking education later in life. Their genuine hunger for knowledge reminded her of her own journey, although she kept the darker chapters of her story carefully locked away in the past. They still maintained certain essential precautions, of course. Separate bank accounts under their new identities, a secure satellite phone for emergency contact with Carlos, who now managed the legitimate Valentini businesses, and regular security sweeps of their property. Old habits died hard, even in paradise. Each year on her father's birthday, Claire privately reviewed all the damning evidence Andrew had painstakingly compiled against those responsible for his murder. The deep satisfaction of knowing that the Calabrese family had been completely dismantled, its ruthless leaders imprisoned for decades on federal charges, brought a profound sense of justice that neither she nor her mother had ever expected to find. The cottage garden had become Claire's consuming passion, a tangible metaphor for their new life slowly taking root. David often found her there among the herbs and flowers, her hands deep in the soil, building something beautiful from scratch, just as they were doing with their precious second chance at life together. Outside their window, waves crashed relentlessly against the rugged Oregon coastline. The rhythmic sound served as a constant reminder of time's ceaseless forward motion. The past couldn't be erased, but it could be transformed, just as they had transformed themselves, finally breaking free from the destructive patterns that had once seemed so utterly inescapable. Thank you all for following this story. If you're enjoying it, please write in the comments which place you're watching from. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the video as your support is important for me to continue creating content.